Histamine has a bicyclic structure composed of two rings, an imidazoles ring and an ethylamine side chain. The imidazoles ring contains two nitrogen atoms and three carbon atoms, while the ethylamine side chain consists of two carbon atoms and an amino group, NH2, which is this group right here. Histamine is synthesized from the amino acid histidine through a chemical reaction catalyzed by an enzyme called histidine decarboxylase. This enzyme removes the carboxyl group from histidine, resulting in the formation of histamine, shown in the image below. Once it is synthesized, histamine is released into the bloodstream and transported to various tissues and organs. Histamine is stored in granules within mast cells and basophils until it is needed. When these immune cells are activated by various stimuli, for example allergens, they release histamine into the surrounding tissue. This release can be rapid and is an essential part of the body's inflammatory response. Histamine is transported to the epithelial glial cells, where it is inactivated by enzymes, for example deamine oxidase. Then it is recycled to photoreceptor cells. Histaminergic neurons are what release histamine, and they are located in the area of the brain called the tuberomammillary nucleus, which is in the posterior hypothalamus. Histamine neurons diffusely empower other wake-promoting brain regions such as the cortex and thalamus, but the actual histamine release does not occur in those areas. This picture shows a cartoon just generally demonstrating where the tuberomammillary nucleus is in the brain compared to other regions where other neurotransmitters come from. There are four known types of receptors for histamine: H1, H2, H3, and H4, and all of them are G-protein coupled receptors, also known as metabotropic receptors. Activation of H1 receptors leads to an excitatory response. When histamine binds to H1 receptors, its activation is associated with various allergic responses, vasodilation, and bronchoconstriction. On the next slide here, you can see brain images measured by PET measuring histamine H1 receptor occupancy after oral administration of a non-sedating antihistamine called levocetirizine, and you can see a lot of activation of the brain in these scans due to this binding. That's all it's showing. Activation of H2 receptors leads to an excitatory response also. When histamine binds to these receptors, it triggers an increase in cyclic AMP levels within the target cell, leading to increased excitation. Activation of H3 receptors lead to inhibitory responses. Histamine binding to H3 receptors typically reduces the release of histamine and other neurotransmitters from neurons. Activation of H4 receptors leads to both excitatory and inhibitory responses, and these receptors are primarily expressed in immune cells and have roles in inflammation, chemotaxis, and immune responses. Also, this cartoon on the right here just gives a general idea of the histamine receptors and where they are relative to the cell.
Our study was performed using the brain slices of rats, specifically looking at the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus. Pieces of tissue were placed in high histamine concentrations and then studied to see their voltage potentials. Overall, it could be seen that less voltage-gated sodium channels opened, meaning that there is less depolarization in the studies with histamine. Even after the samples were washed, you could still see a 42% decrease in depolarization, meaning that there is less voltage created. Now, it should be noted that the purpose of this study was to look at the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus because that is what controls our sleep. And as such, people with higher histamine concentrations, and we'll go into why that would happen later, are going to have worse sleep and messed up neurological rhythms. So the roles of histamine. So histamine is the regulator of sleep in our bodies. Higher histamine is correlated with being awake, and lower histamine is correlated with sleepiness. So that's why if you take something like Benadryl, which is an antihistamine, that's why you're going to feel tired. Histamine also signals for the creation of stomach acid, meaning that it's vital in the gastrointestinal system. Furthermore, it is what's used by antibodies when a pathogen is detected to try to break it down. So there's definitely a lot of illnesses that can be caused by histamines, and I think the most important is probably allergies. So going back to what we said about white blood cells are going to spray histamines, that's normally in response to a pathogen. But what allergies are is when your white blood cells are trained to do that for something that's not actually a pathogen, and you're going to end up just having a lot of histamine in your blood. You could also have a histamine intolerance, which is caused by a lack of diamine oxidase, which is the enzyme that normally breaks down histamine. And what that's going to lead to is also high histamine concentration in your blood. As such, you're going to have gastrointestinal problems because you're going to keep creating stomach acid, but then you're also going to have real problems like congestion, runny nose. Some people's eyes are itchy, but I think the biggest problem that you could have is anaphylactic shock, which can be life threatening. It's going to basically just shut down your body. You're going to have a rash, nausea, vomiting, and you're not going to be able to breathe. So there are drugs to combat histamines, and one of the ones that does it presynaptically would be antihistamines. So these are like Benadryl, Claritin, and Allegra. And what they're going to do is just block histamine receptors in your neurons. But then you could also affect histamine postsynaptically using like corticosteroids, which are just anti-inflammatories to reduce the response like in your lungs and on your skin of histamines. And then another naturally occurring hormone is epinephrine. And what that's going to do is try to help you when you're having like anaphylactic shock and stuff like that. But if you don't have enough just normally in your body, you can use something like an EpiPen to give you a shot of epinephrine and to try to help your body respond.